guys, Nike here. The recent balance patch included some massive changes for Warrior, Hammer, and the defense trait line that I discussed in my patch preview video. The net result of these changes is that Hammer Spellbreaker is in fact, as predicted, a top tier DPS build in the meta. There are two flavors of this build, Tactics or Defense. They have almost identical DPS, but Tactics has better burst, with Defense having slightly better sustained damage. The selling point of the Defense trait line, though, is in addition to the more sustained damage, but it also has some nifty tools utility-wise built into the spec, one of which is extraordinarily powerful, and we'll discuss it definitely later in the video. Today's video, I will be talking exclusively about the defense version of the build. Why is that? The issue I have with the Tactics variant is any fight where the Tactics variant is preferable to defense, you should probably be playing the Greatsword Spellbreaker build that I have elsewhere on my channel. If you are going to use Tactics, you're doing it for the burst damage, and if you're going for the burst damage, you should pick the build with the best burst, which is the Greatsword Spellbreaker. If you aren't choosing which variant you play exclusively based on burst damage, the features of the Defense Hammer build make it more user-friendly and likely to pull way ahead in damage in many cases, as I will explain. All in all, I find this build extremely fun, and I think it will be hugely powerful in the current meta. It provides top-level DPS, massive CC that very few other builds can equal, built-in tankiness, and boon stripping. All in all, it contributes a ton to the success of any raid, strike, or fractal team. If that interests you, stick around, and I will go over the build. Alright guys, let's talk about the gear for the build. For this build, it is super simple. We are going to go full Berserker in every slot with Superior Rune of the Scholar. For weapons, we're going to use a Hammer and Dagger Axe. Each set will have a Sigil of Force and a Sigil of Impact. It is true that having Force and Hydromancy on your Hammer and Force and Air Sigil on the Dagger will benchmark slightly higher, maybe 100 to 200 DPS higher than the Impact Sigil. But personally, I don't rate that setup, and I do vastly prefer the Impact Sigil setup because, again, while on some bosses the Impact may be 100 or so DPS lower, there are other bosses that get the Exposed and Breakbar debuff, and Impact will be significantly better there. Especially if you're going to use this build also in fractals and on some strike missions, and you're just going to generally use it in raids. You're also going to find it quite helpful at bosses like Keep Construct. So all in all, I think it's just simpler to use Sigil of Impact on every boss and come out probably ahead in the end. If you care about infusions, use 18 power infusions. As always, infusions are optional, but there is no question that 90 extra power is a big damage increase. And of course, if you are an endgame player who has full Ascended gear or Legendary even, and you consider this class to be your main, you should consider investing in 18 power infusions as soon as you can. You may notice that this build does not crit cap by default when using the gear as described. Before anyone asks, the reason that that we do this is because we will maintain between 4 and 5 stacks of Attacker's Insight, which ensures that we always hit 100% crit chance or higher with the build. The build has zero trouble maintaining these stacks of Attacker's Insight, and this is one of the reasons why the Hammer is quite competitive with the Greatsword. Despite being an inferior DPS weapon, it simply has 3 more stacks of Attacker's Insight, so it has 150 extra power and 150 extra ferocity. That's going to put it over the top in a lot of cases. Now, as far as consumables go, you want to use the best in slot power food like sous vide steaks or sweet and spicy curry butternut squash soup if you are on a budget. For utilities, the best thing you can run are writs of Masterful Strength. If RIT gameplay isn't your thing, and I will strongly encourage you to use RITs, especially with this build for reasons that we'll discuss. But if RIT gameplay is not your thing, superior sharpening stones are pretty darn good and will be your next best choice. So with that said, let's talk about the traits. Alright guys, we're going to take strength, defense, and Spellbreaker. In strength, we want the typical setup of peak performance, great fortitude, and berserker's power. If you are a long time or even a short time warrior player, this trait setup is familiar to you and you know all about it, and there's not really much else to say. In defense, we're going to take Cull the Weak, Merciless Hammer, and Stalwart Strength. Since this is the first time in a while many of you have used defense, let's go over all the tools that this trait line gives us in detail. Cull the Weak is going to function as a straight up DPS increase for us, since bosses will have permanent weakness. Also, the ability to inflict weakness on our burst skill is quite nice, and something to remember when fighting trash mobs, that our hammer burst can hit all of them and give them all weakness at the same time, which is super strong. Adrenal Health is absolutely nuts. Adrenal Health is a 400 heal per second free buff that we get, which is just absolutely bonkers. This is going to significantly help us keep up Scholar bonus as well as Writs if that's what you choose to use. It's just great. It's so nice to have. Merciless Hammer is a huge damage boost to our CC skills, but it also gives us adrenaline back when we CC an enemy. This is actually busted and will allow an interaction that I'll discuss when we talk about the rotation, but getting the adrenaline back is super cozy and enables some kind of degenerate gameplay, and we like that. Hardened Armor, you can mostly ignore it. It's not really a PvP thing. It will rarely come up. And then at GM, we go with Stalwart Strength, which is our busted GM trait. Well, why is this trait busted, you might ask? Well, let me explain that to you. It gives us stability on burst, and with this build, that means around 90 to 95% self-stability uptime. In a real raid group, you're also going to get stability from other sources, so you can basically assume that you're going to have perma-stability when you use this skill, and therefore you're going to have a permanent 10% mod. Now, the 10% mod is fine, but not really special for a Grandmaster trait. However, it is very hard to overstate how good having permanent stability is in actual fights. So until you play with it, you're going to have to just trust me that having perma stability in every fight you're in is good, if you're not already convinced. In Spellbreaker, we take Pure Strike, Sun and Moon Style, and Mage Bane Tether. These three traits are, of course, just damage increases. But remember, you can always break your Mage Bane Tether to CC if needed, but I would only do that in an absolute emergency. The key thing to focus on here is Attacker's Insight. If you follow the rotation, you don't have to think about Attacker's Insight in this build. You're going to have either 4 or 5 always. But there are tons of situations where you can really maximize your Attacker's Insight, such as proccing full counter in a large group of enemies, because each enemy that you daze will give you an Attacker's Insight. So if you can hit 5 people with your full counter, then you will get 5 stacks right off the bat of Attacker's Insight. Quite strong. Yeah, and that's really essentially all there is to talk about for traits. For skills, we are going to take To the Limit, Bull's Charge, Signet of Fury, Signet of Might, and Winds of Disenchantment. To the Limit, we are going to use To the Limit at the beginning of every fight to make sure we start the fight with maximum adrenaline. That's the key part. But it should be noted that if you do use this in the middle of a fight, all of your allies gain a dodge, an extra dodge. Will this come up and be something that you find yourself really counting on? Probably not, but there are situations where it can be a quite nice thing to have and to know that you have it, so that way if it ever does come up, you will be able to help your team. Bull's Charge is there as part of our rotation because it helps proc peak performance, as well as knocking down an enemy, which is going to give us, you guessed it, a stack of Attacker's Insight. Signet of Fury helps us crit cap and can be activated for extra burst damage at the end of a fight, or at the end of any phase where the boss is about to go invuln. Signet of Might, just a boring DPS increase, nothing really to discuss there. Winds of Change in the Greatsword build is necessary to help you hit big stacks of Attacker's Insight to counter the loss of activating your Signet. However, we aren't really going to be activating our Signet of Fury in any situation where we're just doing it for Adrenaline because we have to the limit. So therefore, we are going to use Winds of Disenchantment at the start of fights for a little bit of burst damage, as well as the leap finishers getting us up to 5 stacks of Attacker's Insight really, really quick at the start of a fight. In theory, you could switch Winds of Disenchantment out for the Res banner. That would not be bad at all. If you do believe that will be a benefit of your team, go ahead and do that. But by default, you should stick with Winds of Disenchantment. With that said, let's talk about the rotation. Alright, as always guys, I'm going to play the rotation in slow motion and describe the opener and then the looping part of the rotation. This rotation loops perfectly, so it's rather easy to learn, and with a little practice following this guide, you'll have it in no time. Once you know the looping aspect of the rotation, you can repeat infinitely and pump out pretty significant DPS. After the slow motion rotation, I will play it in real time to show it in action speed. One thing that is hyper important to mention is that thanks to Merciless Hammer, the trait, we get Adrenaline back when we CC mobs. Full Counter is a CC. It is very likely that in real fights, you will be able to do your Dagger Burst, Breaching Strike, Full Counter, and then Dagger Burst again with no Adrenaline issue whatsoever, because you are getting the Adrenaline back from the CC. If you can do this, the Dagger part of the rotation should sort of go out the window, and you should prioritize Breaching Strike and Full Counter, since Breaching Strike is your single best skill, and getting an extra cast of it per swap is a big DPS boost. In fact, this synergy is the reason why in many real fights, this build will pull ahead of the Tactics Hammer build, and it's one of the reasons why I recommend this version of the build. If you can't 100% reliably proc Full Counter when you need it, stick to the rotation as I explain it in the video. But again, if you can reliably proc Full Counter, what you want to do is use Full Counter and the extra Breaching Strike in place of one of the auto attack chains in the rotation. You don't really want to replace one of your better attacks like Axe 4 or Axe 5 or Dagger 3 with it, but replacing one of your auto chains with a Full Counter and a third Breaching Strike is really quite good. So with that preamble out of the way, let's get into that rotation. Okay, so we start on our hammer set, and we are going to activate our healing skill to give us full adrenaline. And when that's over, we're going to start channeling Winds of Change. Immediately after Winds of Change, we want to cast our Hammer Burst skill, and then Hammer 3 and Hammer 4, and swap. Once we go to Dagger, Dagger 4, Axe 3, Dagger Burst, and then Dagger 2, and then we are going to Axe 5, and that begins the dagger part of the rotation. After the dagger part, after Axe 5, we're going to do one full dagger auto chain, followed by Bull's Charge. After Bull's Charge, we're going to do 2 auto chains with the dagger. And then we're going to do a Breaching Strike, Axe 4, Dagger 3, swap back to Hammer, Hammer 2, Hammer Burst skill, and then Hammer 3 and Hammer 4. Now we do 2 Hammer auto chains, and then after the Hammer auto chain, we are going to do Hammer 2, Hammer 5. Hammer 5 refreshes the cooldown of Hammer 2, so then we can Hammer 2 again. Hammer Burst, Hammer 3, and swap, and we will repeat the exact same dagger rotation that we did the first time through, where you go 4, 3, burst, 2, and then 5. Then remember, you're going to do 1 auto attack chain with the dagger, and then Bull's Charge. And then you're going to do 2 auto attack chains before you're going to use your burst skill again. And then after we get Axe 4 and Dagger 3 in, we're going to swap back to Hammer and repeat Hammer 2, Hammer Burst, Hammer 4, and Hammer 3. And then again, we're going to do 2 Hammer auto attack chains. And then once again, we'll do, after the second auto attack chain, we're going to do Hammer 2 again, and then Hammer 5 to refresh 2, and then 2 again, and then Hammer Burst, and Hammer 3, and swap, and that is essentially it. It's, as you can see, it's a perfect loop. It's going to be the same thing the whole way through. So that's really, once you learn those 2 sides of the rotation, you're good to go. That's the build, guys. I really enjoy this one. If the Greatsword Spellbreaker build felt like classic Guild Wars 2 Warrior, this sort of feels like classic MMO Hammer Bruiser Warrior from other RPGs. It's a great change of pace from any other warrior build out there and is extremely easy to recommend as a great meta choice. There's really nothing to dislike here. Please do me a favor, give this build a try. Let me know how you like it in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.